The tropical air shimmered with heat waves rising from the concrete runway. July 13, 1945 brought another scorching day to Saipan. Mechanics crawled beneath the wings of massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. Their tools clinked against metal as they performed final inspections. These aircraft looked nothing like the sleek fighters in war movies. They were brutal workhorses, thick bodies, heavy frames, enough destructive power to flatten entire neighborhoods. What unfolded next would crush Japan's faith in protecting their supply routes. These machines would soon demonstrate something remarkable. The most lethal weapons sometimes arrive in the most surprising forms. The P-47 Thunderbolt's Pacific story doesn't begin with glory. It starts with doubt and resistance. When these fighters first reached the theater in 1943, they faced cold reception. Pilots accustomed to twin-engine P-38 Lightning aircraft stared at the stubby P-47. Its milk bottle shape seemed absurd. How could this awkward beast possibly match the agile Japanese Zero fighters? Their worries seemed justified. The P-47 was gigantic for a single-engine fighter. Fully loaded, it weighed 8 tons, one of the heaviest single-engine fighters ever constructed. It guzzled fuel at an alarming rate. This limited its reach across Pacific distances, where missions stretched beyond 800 miles. Most concerning of all, it appeared hopeless for low-altitude dogfighting that dominated Pacific air warfare. Yet hidden within these obvious flaws lay incredible advantages. Soon these would transform the P-47 from rejected stepchild into the Pacific's most dreaded ground attack weapon. The aircraft's story began in 1940. War already consumed Europe. American military planners saw urgent need for advanced fighters. Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian engineer at Republic Aviation, proposed something radical. Build a fighter around the largest, most powerful engine available. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 was an 18-cylinder radial monster. It generated 2,000 horsepower, more power than many bombers possessed. Kartveli's design philosophy was elegant yet revolutionary. If you can't make a fighter light and nimble, make it fast, tough, and deadly. The result absorbed tremendous punishment while delivering even greater destruction in return. 8 50-caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, 4 guns per side, enough ammunition for 30 seconds of continuous fire. This gave the P-47 the heaviest projectile throw weight of any American single-engine fighter. Only the specialized night-fighting P-61 Black Widow carried more firepower. Production began in 1941. Combat wouldn't come until March 10, 1943. The 4th Fighter Group took their Thunderbolts on a sweep over occupied France. That first mission was catastrophic. Radio malfunctions scattered the formation. They achieved nothing. But once these initial problems were solved, the P-47 began proving its value over European skies. Pacific acceptance came much slower. General George Kenney commanded the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific. He desperately needed aircraft. Any aircraft. The beloved P-38 Lightning remained in short supply. Early P-51 Mustangs with Allison engines were proving disappointing. When offered P-47s, Kenney reluctantly accepted. Few expected miracles. The first Thunderbolt unit reaching the Pacific was the 348th Fighter Group. Colonel Neil Kirby commanded it. Unlike many contemporaries, Kirby genuinely believed in the P-47's potential. He understood something crucial. Pacific success wouldn't come from trying to outturn Japanese fighters at low altitude. It would come from exploiting the Thunderbolt's unique advantages. Kirby developed tactics that became the template for P-47 operations throughout the Pacific theater. His pilots climbed to high altitude immediately after takeoff. They used the aircraft's excellent high-altitude performance to gain commanding position above Japanese bases. When targets appeared, they dove at tremendous speed, made their attack, then used momentum to climb back to safety before enemies could react. This boom and zoom approach played directly to the P-47's strengths. Its massive weight, normally a liability in turning fights, became an asset in high-speed dives. The big radial engine continued producing power at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled. Most importantly, the P-47's rugged construction meant it survived damage that would down lighter aircraft. Kirby proved his tactics worked on October 11, 1943. During a sweep over the Japanese base at Wewak, he led a four-ship formation. They encountered a large formation of Japanese fighters and bombers. In the battle that followed, Kirby personally shot down 6 aircraft. His flight claimed 9 total, a remarkable achievement that earned him the Medal of Honor. But Kirby's overall philosophy proved most influential. He wrote the definitive guide for using the Thunderbolt in the Pacific. Maintain altitude advantage. Dive fast. Get close before opening fire. Then climb for another pass. Never get dragged into turning fights at low level. This tactical doctrine worked because it matched P-47 capabilities to Pacific combat realities. The aircraft's 50-caliber machine guns were devastating when properly used. Each gun fed from ammunition boxes containing over 400 rounds. This allowed sustained fire that could shred enemy aircraft or ground targets with equal effectiveness. The ammunition itself was carefully selected for maximum lethality. Armor-piercing rounds penetrated enemy armor plating. Armor-piercing incendiary ammunition ignited fuel tanks and ammunition stores. Tracer rounds allowed pilots to walk their fire onto targets with deadly precision. The combined effect was like having a flying artillery battery, one that could deliver pinpoint strikes wherever needed. As 1943 became 1944, P-47 units began encountering a disturbing trend: fewer and fewer Japanese aircraft to fight. The relentless Allied advance across the Pacific pushed Japanese air power back, but it also created new opportunities. With aerial opposition diminishing, P-47s could turn attention to the vast supply network that kept Japanese forces fighting. Japan's Pacific position depended entirely on seaborne logistics. Every bullet, every grain of rice, every drop of fuel had to be transported by ship across thousands of ocean miles. By 1944, Allied submarines were taking heavy tolls on this shipping, but significant supplies still got through using well-defended convoys that hugged coastlines and island chains. The Japanese learned to move critical supplies in heavily escorted convoys. Typically, 8 to 20 vessels protected by destroyers and covered by fighter aircraft. These convoys followed carefully planned routes designed to minimize submarine exposure. They often moved during daylight hours when air cover could be maintained. For P-47 units scattered across newly captured Pacific islands, these convoys represented ideal targets. Unlike fast maneuverable fighters, they were designed to combat. Merchant ships and escorts were relatively slow and predictable. More importantly, they were vulnerable to the devastating firepower that Thunderbolts carried. The transformation from air superiority fighter to convoy killer began in earnest during the Saipan campaign in June 1944. Thunderbolts from the 7th Air Force's 19th and 73rd Fighter Squadrons found themselves supporting the massive amphibious assault. They provided close air support missions. They quickly discovered their 8 machine guns were extraordinarily effective against ground targets, Japanese defensive positions, supply dumps, communication centers. All proved vulnerable to concentrated P-47 attack firepower. But it was the aircraft's ability to attack moving targets that proved most significant. Trucks, trains, and yes, ships. All fell victim to Thunderbolt guns with alarming regularity. The effectiveness came not just from sheer volume of fire. It came from the precision with which it could be delivered. The P-47's stable gun platform allowed pilots to maintain accurate fire even at high speeds and in turbulent conditions. The wide spacing of wing-mounted guns created a cone of fire that was difficult for targets to escape once the pilot lined up his shot. Most importantly, the aircraft could carry this devastating attack capability across Pacific theater distances. Early P-47s had limited range, but engineers quickly developed solutions. The famous Brisbane tank was a 200-gallon belly tank designed by depot repair squadrons in Australia. It dramatically extended the P-47's operational radius. Later variants, like the P-47N, featured completely redesigned wings with integral fuel tanks. These gave them range approaching 2,000 miles with drop tanks. By late 1944, P-47 units throughout the Pacific routinely launched long-range strikes against Japanese shipping. The attacks followed a predictable pattern. Intelligence located a convoy. P-47s launched from the nearest available base. Then they unleashed their 8 machine guns in devastating low-level attacks. Merchant ships and escorts were left burning in their wakes. The psychological impact on Japanese crews was enormous. Survivors described the sound of P-47 engines as terrifying. A deep, throaty roar that announced impending destruction. The sight of stubby fighters diving out of the sun became synonymous with disaster for Japanese naval personnel. All guns blazing. But perhaps most demoralizing was the sheer inevitability of it all. Japanese convoy commanders knew that once spotted by Allied reconnaissance, they would likely face air attack within hours. The P-47s seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with overwhelming force, then disappear before effective countermeasures could be organized. The numbers tell this transformation story. By war's end, P-47s in all theaters had claimed destruction of 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 68,000 trucks, and 6,000 armored vehicles. But these statistics, impressive as they are, failed to capture the full impact of the P-47's evolution from fighter to convoy killer. In the Pacific specifically, P-47s were responsible for devastating attacks on Japanese shipping. These helped strangle the Empire's ability to supply its far-flung garrisons. Every merchant ship sunk meant fewer supplies reaching Japanese troops. Every transport destroyed represented hundreds of soldiers who would never reinforce threatened positions. Japanese military leadership watched these losses with growing alarm. Convoy after convoy departed Japanese ports, only to arrive at destinations with reduced cargo, or not arrive at all. The P-47s were systematically dismantling Japan's logistics network, one ship at a time. But the most devastating attacks were yet to come. As 1945 dawned, American forces were poised to capture islands within range of Japan itself. Soon, P-47s would be attacking convoys in Japanese home waters, bringing war directly to the Empire's doorstep. The stage was set for the final, most destructive phase of the P-47's Pacific campaign. Japanese planners, still reeling from loss of the Marianas and Philippines, would soon discover their assumptions about American fighter capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. The ungainly P-47, dismissed as too clumsy for Pacific operations, was about to demonstrate just how wrong they had been. In months ahead, 50-caliber machine guns would tear through convoy after convoy with mechanical precision. Each burst of fire represented another nail in the coffin of Japan's ability to continue the war. The transformation was complete. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had become the Pacific's most effective convoy killer. Japan was running out of ships to lose. March 3, 1943, marked a turning point few recognized at the time. High above the Bismarck Sea, Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted a Japanese convoy steaming toward New Guinea. 8 troop transports and 8 destroyer escorts. They carried over 6,000 soldiers. What followed became a template for devastating convoy attacks that P-47s would perfect throughout the Pacific War. General George Kenney's 5th Air Force launched a coordinated assault using every available aircraft. B-17 flying fortresses struck from medium altitude. Australian Beaufighters followed, diving to masthead level. The attacks were devastating. All 8 transports and 4 destroyers went to the bottom. This became known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Of the 6,900 Japanese troops aboard, only 1,200 survived to reach their destination. The lesson was clear. Properly coordinated air attacks could completely destroy even well-defended convoys. But the Bismarck Sea battle relied on multiple aircraft types working together. What if a single aircraft type could achieve similar results operating independently? The P-47 Thunderbolt would soon provide that answer. By early 1945, American forces had captured Iwo Jima. They were preparing for the Okinawa invasion. For the first time in the war, P-47s operated from bases within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The strategic implications were staggering. Japan's vital shipping lanes, previously protected by distance and geography, were now within reach of Allied fighters. The P-47N Thunderbolt had been specifically designed for this moment. With longer wings and enlarged fuel capacity, it could carry 1,200 gallons of fuel. It could fly missions approaching 2,000 miles in range. More importantly, it retained all the devastating firepower that made earlier P-47 variants so effective against ground targets. The 414th Fighter Group, equipped with these long-range P-47Ns, arrived at Northfield on Iwo Jima on July 7, 1945. 6 days later, they flew their first strike mission against Chichijima. This proved the N model could indeed fly very long-range missions alongside the P-51 Mustang, but it was their attacks on Japanese shipping that would define their legacy. Japanese convoy operations by 1945 had become increasingly desperate. Allied submarines controlled most Pacific shipping lanes. B-29 superfortresses pounded Japanese ports. The empire was slowly being strangled. Every successful convoy run was vital to keeping Japanese forces supplied and the home islands fed. The convoys of 1945 were different from earlier years. Ships were larger, escorts more numerous, routes more carefully planned to avoid submarine concentrations. Anti-aircraft defenses had been significantly strengthened after years of painful losses to Allied air attacks. Japanese commanders believed these improvements would provide adequate protection against fighter attacks. They were catastrophically wrong. The first major P-47 convoy attack of 1945 demonstrated just how devastating 50-caliber machine guns could be when properly employed. Intelligence intercepts revealed the departure of a large convoy from the Japanese home islands. It was bound for remaining Pacific garrisons with critically needed supplies. The formation of P-47Ns that intercepted this convoy approached from high altitude. They used the sun to mask their approach. At 15,000 feet, they held every advantage: speed, surprise, and overwhelming firepower. The attack began with a nearly vertical dive. This brought the Thunderbolts to just above sea level in seconds. What happened next lasted only minutes, but survivors would remember it for the rest of their lives. 8 P-47s, each mounting 8 50-caliber machine guns, opened fire simultaneously on the convoy. 64 streams of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition converged on merchant ships and their escorts. The effect was devastating. The concentration of firepower was unlike anything previously seen in Pacific convoy actions. Each P-47 carried over 3,400 rounds of ammunition. This allowed sustained fire that could literally saw through ship superstructures. Armor-piercing rounds punched through hulls below the waterline. Incendiary ammunition ignited fuel stores and cargo holds. The lead transport was a converted passenger liner carrying troops and supplies. It absorbed hits from multiple aircraft. Witnesses described the ship's bridge and superstructure simply disintegrating under concentrated fire. Within minutes, the vessel was listing heavily to port. Her cargo holds blazed. Her crew abandoned ship. The escort destroyers, despite their heavier armor, fared little better. The P-47s had learned to target specific vulnerabilities: bridge structures, ammunition storage areas, engineering spaces. A destroyer might survive hits to her hull, but concentrated fire on her bridge could eliminate command and control in seconds. The psychological impact was as devastating as physical damage. Japanese sailors had grown accustomed to submarine attacks. These typically involved single torpedo hits, followed by a fighting chance to save their ship. Air attacks by traditional dive bombers or torpedo planes followed predictable patterns. These could be defended against with concentrated anti-aircraft fire. But P-47 attacks were different. The aircraft approached too fast for effective tracking. They delivered firepower in concentrated bursts that overwhelmed defensive systems, then disappeared before meaningful retaliation was possible. There was no time to organize damage control, no opportunity to fight back effectively. More importantly, the sheer volume of projectiles made survival largely a matter of luck rather than skill or preparation. A single P-47 firing all 8 guns could put over 60 bullets into a target area every second. Multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously created a storm of lead that few ships could survive. The technical specifications that once seemed like mere numbers on paper now translated into overwhelming tactical advantage. Each 50-caliber round weighed approximately 1.5 ounces. It traveled at nearly 3,000 feet per second. At close range, these projectiles could penetrate several inches of steel plating, or punch completely through lightly armored vessels. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds were particularly devastating against shipping. They would penetrate the target, then ignite whatever flammable material they encountered inside. Fuel tanks, ammunition storage, cargo holds filled with supplies, all became secondary weapons when struck by these specialized rounds. The psychological warfare aspect cannot be understated. Japanese crews learned to fear the distinctive sound of approaching P-47 engines, a deep, throaty roar created by the massive R-2800 radial power plant. Unlike the high-pitched whine of diving fighters, the P-47's approach could be heard from miles away. This created precious minutes of anticipation and terror before the attack began. Survivors described the attacks as surreal experiences. The initial approach seemed almost leisurely. Large, stable aircraft maintaining formation and approaching with obvious hostile intent. Then came the dive. This transformed the seemingly ponderous fighters into screaming projectiles that closed distance with shocking speed. The actual attack phase lasted only seconds, but those seconds contained an eternity of destruction. The sight of 8 aircraft opening fire simultaneously created a visual spectacle that witnesses struggled to describe. One survivor likened it to watching lightning strike in broad daylight. Another described streams of fire reaching out from the sky to touch their ship. The aftermath was equally memorable. P-47s would typically make 1 or 2 passes before departing. They left behind burning ships, scattered debris, and survivors clinging to whatever wreckage remained afloat. The speed of the attacks meant rescue operations, if they came at all, arrived to find scenes of complete devastation. But individual attacks, devastating as they were, represented only part of the story. The cumulative effect of these convoy losses was slowly paralyzing Japan's ability to continue the war. Every merchant ship destroyed represented thousands of tons of supplies that would never reach their destination. Every transport sunk meant hundreds of troops who could not reinforce threatened positions. Japanese military leadership found themselves facing an impossible situation. Convoys traveling close to shore could be protected by land-based fighters, but only at the cost of exposing those precious aircraft to attrition they could no longer afford. Convoys venturing into open water faced submarine attacks that were equally devastating. There seemed to be no safe route for vital supplies. The P-47 attacks were particularly effective because they exploited a gap in Japanese defensive planning. The Empire's naval strategists had prepared for traditional air attacks using dive bombers and torpedo planes. They had developed tactics for dealing with submarine threats, but they had not anticipated massed fighter attacks using aircraft with the range to operate hundreds of miles from base. By late 1945, P-47 units throughout the Pacific were conducting routine convoy hunting missions that would have been impossible just 2 years earlier. The 318th Fighter Group's operations around Okinawa were particularly notable. They demonstrated the aircraft's ability to intercept potential kamikaze attacks while simultaneously devastating Japanese shipping. In 2 sweeps, conducted on May 25 and 28, 1945, these P-47s claimed nearly 40 aerial victories while also attacking numerous surface targets. The dual capability meant Japanese convoys faced threats both from the P-47s themselves and from the reduction in air cover caused by P-47 attacks on Japanese fighters. Statistics compiled by War's End tell a story of systematic destruction. While exact figures for Pacific convoy losses attributable to P-47s remain classified or lost, the overall numbers are staggering. P-47s operating in all theaters claimed destruction of over 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railroad cars, 68,000 trucks, and 6,000 armored vehicles. In the Pacific specifically, P-47s were credited with devastating attacks on Japanese shipping that contributed significantly to the Empire's logistical collapse. The Mexican 201st Fighter Squadron, operating P-47s as part of the 5th Air Force, flew 791 sorties against Japanese forces without losing a single pilot or aircraft to enemy action. This was a testament to both the aircraft's durability and the effectiveness of tactics developed for convoy attacks. But beyond the numbers lay a human cost that was equally significant. Every convoy attack represented dozens or hundreds of individual tragedies. Sailors who never made it home, soldiers who drowned far from any battlefield, supplies that never reached the people who desperately needed them. The crews of Japanese merchant vessels faced impossible odds. Unlike military personnel, they had not trained for combat operations. Many were civilian sailors pressed into service as the war consumed Japan's maritime workforce. When P-47s appeared on the horizon, these men faced weapons and tactics for which no training could prepare them. The attackers, for their part, were young American pilots who had trained for air-to-air combat, but found themselves conducting what amounted to maritime warfare. The transition from fighter pilot to convoy killer was not always easy. Many struggled with the moral implications of attacking merchant vessels, even when those vessels were clearly supporting enemy military operations. Yet the strategic necessity was undeniable. Japan's ability to continue the war depended entirely on maintaining supply lines across the Pacific. Every successful convoy run prolonged the conflict and increased Allied casualties. The P-47 attacks, devastating as they were to individual crews and ships, ultimately served to shorten the war and save lives on both sides. As August 1945 arrived, Japan found itself in an impossible strategic position. The home islands were under constant bombardment by B-29s, operating from bases that P-47s helped capture and defend. The remaining Pacific garrisons were slowly starving. Convoy after convoy fell victim to submarine and air attack. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August ultimately ended the war. But Japan's position had already become untenable, due in large part to the systematic destruction of its logistics network. The P-47 Thunderbolt, initially dismissed as unsuitable for Pacific operations, had proven instrumental in achieving this strategic strangulation. The transformation was complete. An aircraft originally designed for high-altitude air combat in European skies had evolved into the Pacific's most effective convoy killer. The 50-caliber machine guns that had once seemed merely adequate for fighter-versus-fighter combat had proven devastatingly effective against surface targets. Japanese military leadership's initial assessment of American fighter capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. They had prepared for graceful, maneuverable aircraft that would engage in traditional dogfighting. They had not anticipated the arrival of flying gun platforms that could deliver overwhelming firepower with mechanical precision. The P-47's success in the Pacific ultimately changed naval warfare itself. Future conflicts would see increasing emphasis on air attacks against shipping. Commanders recognized the devastating potential of properly employed fighter bombers. The age of the battleship was ending. It was replaced by an era where air power could project decisive force across vast oceanic distances. The lessons learned from P-47 convoy operations would influence aircraft design for decades. The importance of heavy armament, long-range, and robust construction became standard requirements for fighter aircraft. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed in the 1970s, carried forward many of the same principles that made the original Thunderbolt so effective. Overwhelming firepower delivered by a durable platform capable of absorbing significant damage. But perhaps the most important legacy was tactical rather than technical. The P-47's Pacific operations demonstrated that innovative thinking could transform apparent weaknesses into decisive advantages. An aircraft too heavy for traditional dogfighting became ideal for convoy attacks. Limited maneuverability was offset by devastating firepower and exceptional durability. The 50-caliber machine guns that seemed almost quaint compared to cannon-armed enemy fighters proved perfectly suited to destroying the thin-skinned merchant vessels that kept Japan's war machine running. Sometimes the right weapon is not the most sophisticated, but the one that best matches mission requirements. As the last P-47 missions of World War II were flown in August 1945, they marked the end of an era. Never again would single-engine fighters operate with such devastating effect against naval targets. The advent of jet aircraft, guided missiles, and improved naval defenses would change the nature of maritime air warfare. But the P-47 Thunderbolt had proven that when properly employed, conventional weapons could achieve extraordinary results. Japan had never expected that 50-caliber machine guns mounted on an aircraft they considered unsuitable for Pacific operations would help bring their empire to its knees. The stubby, ungainly fighter that pilots had initially nicknamed the Jug had earned a new reputation. It became one of history's most effective convoy killers. In the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, where distance and logistics determined campaign outcomes, the P-47 Thunderbolt had helped turn the tide of war. One convoy at a time, the transformation was remarkable. What began as an unwanted, overweight fighter had evolved into an instrument of strategic devastation. Japanese shipping, once protected by distance and geography, found itself helpless against the reach and firepower of these American fighters. The 850 caliber machine guns that had seemed like overkill for air-to-air combat proved perfectly suited for tearing through ship hulls and superstructures. The massive radial engine that made the aircraft heavy and ungainly also gave it the power to carry devastating loads of ammunition across Pacific distances. Most importantly, the rugged construction that made the P-47 seem crude compared to more refined fighters allowed it to survive the hazardous environment of low-level attacks against heavily defended targets. While lighter aircraft might be brought down by a single lucky hit, the Thunderbolt could absorb tremendous punishment and continue fighting. The Japanese had prepared for many threats. They had not prepared for flying artillery pieces that could appear without warning, deliver devastating firepower with surgical precision, then disappear before effective retaliation was possible. Their convoy system, designed to counter submarine attacks and traditional bombing raids, proved helpless against this new form of warfare. By war's end, the sight of P-47s on the horizon had become synonymous with disaster for Japanese naval forces. The deep roar of R-2800 engines meant death was approaching at 400 miles per hour. There would be no time for elaborate, evasive maneuvers, no opportunity for heroic last stands. Just seconds of overwhelming firepower, followed by silence and wreckage. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had completed its unlikely journey from rejected fighter to convoy killer supreme. In the process, it had helped strangle an empire and change the nature of warfare itself. The Pacific War had taught a valuable lesson about the unexpected ways that weapons could be employed. Sometimes the most devastating attacks came from the most unlikely sources.